Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from the fourth chapter in Peter's first epistle. Now, the writing of 1 Peter was very much motivated by the reality of persecution. So, persecution is very much the norm for Christians in any age. And the persecution we experience in America as 21st century Christians is comparatively benign to that which is experienced in other places of the world and throughout history. And Peter wrote it from Rome while he was in there, and that is the site that he would eventually his life would be claimed by the sadistic emperor Nero. And according to legend, Peter was crucified upside down as he did not feel himself worthy to imitate or mimic the master. So the opening verse reads, "Therefore, since Messiah suffered for you in the flesh, arm yourself also with the same mind, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." So as disciples, our worth is very much contingent on the one we disciple ourselves to, the Messiah. And if he suffered for us, for our sakes, and for our purpose, the very least that we can do is suffer for him. And this is not extra credit, it is the minimal obligation. And we are not to seek suffering, but we are to embrace it when it comes and not avoid it. And this requires courage and not cowardice, so that he no longer lives the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but according to the will of Elohim. Therein we learn that the lust of men are antithetical to the will of Elohim, and the will of man, the natural man, left unattended to, is motivated by the pursuit of fulfilling their various lusts, but Elohim's plan is wiser and better, and we are to live our lives seeking out his will and doing his will and proclaiming his will. And there are a multitude of challenges to this. Now, to obey the will often compels us to disobey ourselves, for the divine will and the self are rarely in harmony. "For enough of our past lifetime we have done the will of the Gentiles, having walked in indecencies, lust, drunkenness, orgies, wild parties, and abominable idolatries." By this time, the Gentiles would have displaced the Jewish nucleus as the majority of the nascent Christian sect, and so he is writing to his audience in mind. And Peter was, of course, Jewish by background, but he was relating to an experience with which his median audience member could relate. The way of the Gentiles is walking in indecencies, lust, drunkenness, orgies, wild parties, and abominable idolatries. All of these are inherently and invariably negative, and we are to live our lives better than pursuing our baser instincts and our carnal lusts. "In which they are surprised that you do not run with them in the same flood of loose behavior, blaspheming." So when we break off our friendships with the people we associated with in the pre-regenerate life, they will be shocked and surprised that we no longer find pleasure in the pursuits with which we used to seek for our own pleasure. And if you don't get rid of the wrong friends, you will never meet the right friends. We are to exercise discernment in all our decisions, including and especially who we associate with. Now, from the Christianity, we form a common bond with all other Christians, inasmuch as they are authentic Christians. "Who shall give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." Now, the Gentiles or the unbelievers may judge us in this life, but an inescapable, final, and ultimate judgment, whether they know it or not, awaits them. And so we are promised to participate in the judgment of the wicked at the day of its arrival. "For this reason, the good news was also brought to those who are dead, so that whereas they are judged according to men in the flesh, they might live according to Elohim in the Spirit." Now, dead is not literally dead, but dead in trespasses and sin. We read of this concept in Ephesians 2:1 and a few other places. So it is possible to be alive physically and dead spiritually, and those are the ones who need to hear it most, and there is redemptive potential in even the most wayward reprobate. So we are not to excuse our evangelical inclination and not finding a receptive audience. Our job is to present the message faithfully and accurately, regardless of results. Yahweh rewards the effort and not the outcome. But the end of all has drawn near. Therefore, be sober-minded and be attentive in the prayers. Now, Peter and the apostles lived with the expectation that they would live to witness to see the Messiah's second coming and be raptured and resurrected in their own lifetimes. This, as we know, as history has progressed since then, did not happen, and a lot of that hopeful expectation has died out in the church since then. But we are instructed to be sober-minded. That means clear-headed and not intoxicated by any contaminating thoughts. And sober-minded, we are also admonished in Peter 5:8 to be with the reality and the presence of the adversary, who is compared to a roaming lion. And attentive in prayers, that means we do not enter prayer for its own sake or mindlessly, or do not regurgitate repetitive slogans, but we are to be attentive in the prayers. And this demands both attentiveness to speaking and listening, because prayer ought not to be considered exclusively speaking, but supplementally, the balance in its supplementary component is listening and meditation. So not only do we speak to Elohim, but he can speak to us if we let him and if we develop the ears of faith to hear him speak. And above all, have fervent love for one another, because love covers a great number of sins. Now, this is alternately translated as multitude of sins, but the basically synonymous terms. This is a citation from Proverbs 17:9. So love, it expiates, that's the theological term for covers, a multitude of sins, and expiation pertains also to our forgiveness from sin. And the original expiation occurs in Genesis 3:21, when Adam and Eve are self-conscious at the fact and the sight of their own nakedness, which compels them to construct clothes out of fig leaves, and Yahweh kills a rabbit for them to cover their nakedness, analogous to sin. Welcome one another without grumbling. So that we welcome others is not so important as how we welcome others. And there's no place, there's no reason to welcome others in an unwelcoming manner. And grumbling is very unwelcome. It is not an attractive attitude, and it repels people who might otherwise be inclined to join our flock and participate in our fellowship. As each one has received a gift, serve one another as good trustees of the manifold grace of Elohim. Now, every single person, whether they know it or not, has at least one spiritual gift, and we are to utilize the gifts at our disposal for the common collective good, serve one another. And our gifts do not, strictly speaking, belong to us, even though we somewhat possess them. They are gifts, ergo they derive from a second-hand source, an external source, and that source is the Ruach Kadesh, who enables us to perform our duties and pertaining to worship and fellowship and evangelism and edification and all the rest. And we are to have the mind of a steward, in that we do not own the gifts we exercise, and they are not for individual enjoyment, but for corporate employment. If anyone speaks as the words of Yahweh, if anyone serves with the strength which Elohim provides, so that Yahweh might be praised in it all, through Yahshua the Messiah, to whom belongeth the esteem and the rule forever and ever. Amen. So whether we preach or proclaim or we serve, that's the spiritual gifts of helps, broadly speaking. We are to be mindful that that we speak and we work with the mind of Elohim, and our words reflect his thoughts and his will as expressed throughout the canon. And it is to be praise and uplifting and optimistic outlook we are to project for our Heavenly Father and his sacred Son. Beloved ones, do not be surprised at the fiery trial that is coming upon you, to try you as though some unusual matter had befallen you. So they are taught to expect persecution, and not only to expect it, but to embrace it. It is part of each and every one of our callings to suffer the reproaches of the world and to carry our crosses. Now, that does not have to mean a literal cross, and our salvation is secured not through our own crucifixion, but the bitter passion and atonement of the Messiah, who is alone constitutionally capable of purchasing and securing our salvation. And persecution is a fact of life in every age and every country of human history throughout the Christian experience. And as I earlier mentioned, the persecutions we experience and endure in 24th century America, although they are noticeably deteriorating from the previous century, are still rather benign compared to that which other Christians experience in other parts of the world and in other places in history. But as you share Messiah's suffering, rejoice, in order that you might rejoice exultingly at the revelation of his esteem. Now, this brings to mind Paul's fellowship of the suffering. In other translations, it's partake of the Messiah's suffering. So when we join him in our suffering, he joins with us. He enters into our pains and feels our suffering. And he, because he has suffered and been tempted, in as the author of Hebrews writes in 4:14 through 16, or thereabouts, somewhere in that range, that because the Messiah was tempted as we are and experienced all the vulnerabilities and vicissitudes of the flesh, he is able to empathize with us in our dilemmas. So our persecutions and pains and suffering ought not compromise our faith or diminish it, but to enhance it and bring us closer to the one who suffered so willingly for us. If you are reproached for the name of Messiah, blessed, because the Ruah, the spirit of esteem and of Elohim, rest upon you. On their part he is blasphemed, but on your part he is praised. So those who inflict unmerited injury and suffering in our direction are effectively blaspheming and taking the name, even if they do not mention it in a vulgar, crass, or crude or casual manner. They are bringing the name into disrepute, and when we take the name and assume it, we assume an awful responsibility, and it is also a pleasure and a privilege, but it's not always pleasurable. It often demands suffering, and rightly so, and suffering is the supreme act of love, self-sacrifice, and no more should we desire to live without love should we expect to endure this life without suffering. And suffering does have a remedial quality and a redemptive quality if it is aligned with the suffering of the Messiah. For you do not let any of you suffer as a murderer, or thief, or doer of evil, or as a meddler. But if being Messiah, let him not be ashamed, but let him esteem Elohim in this matter. So it is a counterintuitive approach to praise Elohim in the midst of our suffering. The natural man will often become violent and hostile and antagonistic to the Elohim who they blame for their trials and tribulations. With the gift of revelation, we know better that our suffering is for a greater purpose, and our greater purpose can only come from the one whose purpose is greater than our own, and our purpose in this life is to lay hold of that purpose, and when we do, we will find ourselves in our eternal identity. Because it is time for judgment to begin from the house of Elohim, and if firstly from us, what is the end of those who do not obey the good news of Elohim? So as I earlier mentioned, we have the privilege and hope and expectation of participating in the judgment of the wicked. And the second epistle to that Peter directed, which is a general epistle in that it's directed to no one in particular, but has a universal audience in mind, is devoted to cleaning house. So if persecution is the external source of our division and deficiencies, then those are exacerbated by the wolves in sheep clothing from within. Heretics have been a very real and dangerous presence in Christianity since its inception, and the adversary always has a foot in the door and outside the door of the church, because it is the conspirators' advantage to control both sides of conflicts in as much as they are able. And if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where shall the wicked and the sinner appear? Now, this is a rhetorical question that the opening part of which suggests that none are righteous. None of us are righteous, at least not in ourselves, righteous enough to secure our salvation, and it is only through the appropriation of an alien and perfect righteousness, which is imputed to us, to our account on our behalfs, from him to us, that we are enabled to endure. And the fate of the wicked and sinner is self-evident in this light, in that if we ourselves, who are righteous as measured by the standards of man, are not righteous enough before Elohim, how much more so are those who live in waywardness and wickedness. So then, those who suffer according to the will of Elohim should commit their lives to a trustworthy Creator in doing good. Now, why would it be his will to suffer? And the answer is that the gospel is proclaimed, or the good news is proclaimed and enhanced, and our suffering bears an effective and worthy witness to our Creator, who wants the best for us, but the path of salvation is simple, but it is not easy, nor should it be. So with that exalted expectation comes lofty demands, and rightly so. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.